Chairman, you haven't called my name, but the Secretariat has pointed to me, so may I speak?
Mówiłem pan poseł Agnew, powtarzam.
Right, thank you. Okay, I ought to just declare
I said MEP Agnew.
that I am a sugar beet grower in the United Kingdom, but I'm not really here to particularly talk about that. We are, everyone now, all the beet growers in the United Kingdom, are waiting for the contract offer to come from British Sugar, who is a monopoly processor, and it's likely to be very bad news, a cut in quota and a cut in price. And we hope that they do leave us with a price that we can make a profit at, even if the area we grow is rather low. The problem that we've got is that other commodities are low in value, low in price, so you can't switch easily to something else. It couldn't have come at a worse time, but we hope that because they have a monopoly position, British Sugar will behave responsibly. It'll be quite a test for them, actually. Now, the representative of the Commission made two statements. He said that there's a carryover stock of 2.5 million tonnes, and then he said there's no surplus sugar to stockpile. He then said that statement doesn't make much sense, and I would have to agree with him. I wonder if he could just explain that a little bit. I mean, either there is a surplus or there isn't. Perhaps there was a problem with the interpretation, I don't know. Are there any MEPs from Finland here? I doubt it. Well, that was a country that had the opportunity to restructure and get grants for dissolving its sugar industry. And there's going to be a problem there now, I would have thought, with these very low prices. And I wonder if the representative of the Commission had any thoughts on Finland, because I cannot see how they can really keep going there, personally. You mentioned post-2017, and if ever, this is when the quotas all go, so it could be mayhem. And if ever there was an opportunity to use futures markets, this was it. But unfortunately, the Parliament, the European Parliament and the Commission have made this a lot more difficult with something I think that's called the MIFID. That's an acronym, the MIFID rules, which are going to make futures market a lot more difficult to use, and yet we really do need them now. I don't want to bash the Commission all the time. I don't like it. Many in here don't like it when they keep proposing rules, but they do offer some useful services, and one is a price observatory for milk, and the representative here was talking about one for sugar, and I would have thought that that was a very useful service for the Commission to undertake, so we know where we are. I mean, we're after all paying them. And I'd just like to mention yeast, and the yeast producers have approached me and say that they would particularly like a transparent market post-2017, and they would like two different sugar markets to be assessed rather than just the one that is where sugar is directly used as a food and the other where it's indirectly used, and that could be monitored. So you mentioned price observatory, and I think this is my response to those comments. Now we go on to cane, and in the United Kingdom, long before we joined the European Union, we always imported a great deal of cane from the ACP. We felt we had that obligation. And the big worry here now is that this has become a lopsided market, whereas the processors of beet can get their product, an unlimited amount of raw material and product. The way the EU is operating the system for cane is making it very difficult for the cane refiners. And this was a problem in the last term, and the Commissioner then never really faced up to it, in my opinion. Finally, we finish on health. And I think it's interesting that there is an anti-sugar campaign going on because they're saying it's unhealthy. And yet one reads in yesterday's papers that we should be eating more chocolate, which contains quite a lot of sugar, to help protect our health. So whether the Commission would like to respond on what is the healthy option or what isn't, I'd be interested to hear. Thank you, Chairman.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, this gives me an opportunity to perhaps clarify one or 2 points here. First of all, the current state of play, which hasn't been foreseen and came about because of a preempting of a massive amount of out of quota sugar, which is going to be transferred next year as quota sugar. This price reduction has now been at a very low level historically, but let's not forget that the year before that, and the year before, etc., had very good years, and the price of sugar was more than 700 euros a ton then. So it's the same thing, isn't it, always in agriculture? You can have a whole series of 2 or 3 good years, and then one bad year, and then you go back to a better year, less good year, up and down. That's agriculture for all production. And so I would suggest that we don't get too bogged down in this. You can have a bad year, and it might come hot on the heels of 3 exceptionally good years. Obviously, it's difficult for us to react to the current situation because the instruments we have at our disposal do not lend themselves to such a response. For example, private storage. The conditions are set in the regulation are not met, so we can't do something along those lines. Limiting imports, for example. Well, it's the price on the European Union market which discourages imports, and to answer Mr. Dantin's point, our imports are far lower than they were last year and the year before that. For example, from the least developed countries and the ACPs, we've seen a 200,000 ton reduction. It's not the end of the year yet, but it's 200,000 tons less already. And for quota CXL quota, it's at 0. And we ought to be having 650,000 tons on that one. So that's an amount that hasn't come into the European Union by way of imports. So there has been a very considerable reduction in our imports, and it's perfectly logical because prices are simply not going to pay people adequately, and imports therefore don't happen. One other thing that was quoted were production costs. Well, the production of that tax comes within the European budget and has already been allocated. We cannot consider this some kind of reserve that you could reallocate. No. Sugar sector resources, if they were to be granted, would have to be a minus for some other sector of an equivalent amount, and we don't have a legal base to be able to make changes of that kind. Another thing I heard was a plea in favour of production from our outermost regions. Now, we know about this, and in the Commission services we do try to pay very considerable attention to it. This is kind of niche production, really, and is given particular attention in the negotiation of bilateral agreements. What is planned here is to exclude them from the negotiations entirely. One other very important point is this COM cessation after 2013 with a beefing up for certain types of production, but not sugar, because that already existed, but for other kinds of production, the beefing up, that is, then, of the position of producers within the sector. Well, we're pretty clear that these agricultural duties, and that being the case, were an interpretation to have to be made, it would have to be interpreted by the Commission and the agricultural services in the Commission. I'm sure you know as well as I do, it's the Court of Justice that interprets the legal text, but initially, were some interpretation to have to be made of agricultural duty provisions, then it would, in the first instance, come from those services. But I know that DG Competition, well, competition law applies at all times, in all places, and consequently it may be legitimate for them also to have a look at the application that is made of those provisions. Generally speaking, when it comes to bilateral agreements, I mean, that might be TTIP or it might be other agreements. We consider sugar to be a sensitive sector, and that being the case, we have to take measures that take that sensitive characteristic into account, particularly when we're negotiating with countries that have a highly developed protective policy set up for their production. 1 ton that gets a subsidy one way or another is still to be held up as an equivalent to 1 ton that doesn't get some kind of subsidy, and that mustn't be forgotten in the negotiations. I'm not particularly worried about it, actually. I'm not particularly worried about what's been said about those countries who may subsidize or protect their industry. India was mentioned. Well, India, the situation there for growers is absolutely terrible. This is cane sugar growers. They're not being paid. There are billions of rupees that are owed. I mean, are they going to be developing their production if they're not getting paid? I doubt it. So these countries have their own problems, and that may result in them pressing ahead with policies that are ones that we've chosen not to pursue, but the impact of that policy are not likely to affect us too negatively, because I think that what they do in their part of the world is not likely to come about in quite the way that it was intended. Competitiveness of the sugar sector within the European Union has 3 legs. First of all, productivity gains by beet growers. There's no doubt about that. Beet growers are ever more productive. You get more and more sugar out of the beet. You get more and more sugar out of less and less land, or however you want to measure it. So there are big productivity gains that are well known among sugar beet growers. Then I've talked about the restructuring that the sector has experienced, the industrial part of the sector. That's been considerable. Massive investments, huge productivity gains that have resulted. Then processing, maybe that's taking slightly longer in calendar months terms, but if you look at it over the time frame when the production of the sugar takes place, that's not the case. And the same applies to the refiners. I mean, the refiners have invested in new capacity, up-to-date, efficient plant and machinery on the outskirts of the European Union where there's no beet. There must be an economic justification for that, and I would say, given how up-to-date that investment is, they would be perfectly capable of facing up to competition from other countries. Now, Brazil's been mentioned, and yes, that's... I mean, what more could they do? Their currency is in continual decline, they've been losing value for the last couple of years, and it continues. So it's a price war. That's the kind of price war they're engaged in. And the third leg of competitiveness in the sector is also the value of the euro. And the value of the euro at the moment is helping us in competition terms for the sugar sector, the proof being that we've increased in percentage terms our exports of quota sugar very considerably. Sugar that is part of the price guarantee under the quota system has increased. So all of that shows that the competitiveness of the sector is there, it has improved, and I'm pretty persuaded myself that the productivity gains are not going to stop there. Improvements in production from beet sugar is not going to stop. There's more research, there's not an investment in the sector, and all the improvements on the industrial side, it's all going to carry on because it's the same thing. You invest, you do your research, you get your results and your outcome from that. So I don't really see that stopping. There's one final component here which is not so favourable, and I haven't mentioned it yet, and that's ethanol, bioethanol. Well, bioethanol is obviously not being promoted at the moment, or is not in a favourable situation at the moment, because fossil fuel prices are low compared with what we have known traditionally, and that doesn't promote production of bioethanol. And bioethanol is also extremely dependent on regulations in force and the incorporation of it into fuels used, and there's a certain degree of there's a high degree of uncertainty for the sector in that regard. So, Chairman, perhaps to sum up, let's not forget that the current year is a difficult year, but it comes just after some very good years, and what growers and the industry has achieved and the efforts that have been put into all of this, I think, put us in a very strong position. Neither of them am I particularly worried about the refinery industry side of things, which is going to maintain its non-duty, non-quota access to raw sugar coming in from the poorest countries, the ACP countries, and that using the latest technology. So I think it's productive, and I think the sector as a whole is likely, as I see it, to be able to grasp the opportunities that the world market is likely to offer it in the future, and certainly as of 2017, when we will get rid of the quota for our exports. Thank you very much, Chairman.